Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Eliana Aaron. It's May 11th, 2020. Um, Israel just released some information about international flights and what is being planned and just being transparent about the process because a lot of us are concerned about traveling either to Israel, from Israel, or just traveling in general. And these are um, some of the facts and ideas that are going around in the international community in terms of restarting the tourism industry and the flight industry. And as we all know, these are industries that hold together economies of many countries, responsible for millions of jobs around the world. Certainly in Israel, a large percentage of the income that's generated in Israel is from the tourism industry. So this is a really big deal for us. So I'm going to just go through it so that you could sort of see what's going on and what direction people are thinking about. So right now, most countries have a 14-day quarantine when people enter the country from a different country. And there are some exemptions and exceptions. Sweden has a 2-day quarantine. Holland and Denmark don't have a mandatory quarantine, it's just a recommendation. And in the US and the United Kingdom, there's no mandatory quarantine now. So, you know, Europe passed a regulation that they want the skies to remain closed until June 15th. And there's a thought that they will open first to Europe and then to other countries, because again, the borders of Europe are pretty porous, and people are able to travel freely between the countries, but this would be the flights opening up between those same countries, which, you know, makes sense to a good degree. There are 4 main options for opening the borders that are being considered by different countries. And these are different criteria to try to maintain safety, but also to open things up. So the first one is cataloging countries by their risk and by how well they were able to cope with coronavirus or how well they're coping now. And so each country would be ranked from 1 to 4, and countries from 3 and over would not be able to travel until they were down to a safer level. So how does this affect some countries? Well, Romania, for example, is categorizing countries by color. So there's red hotspots, which are countries that have higher rates of contagion and are not being well managed, and yellow is a shade lower than that. And then you have countries that are cooling off quite a bit. So they're going to categorize that way. So the second option is something called the travel bubble, and that's something Israel is looking into as well. The travel bubble is, you know, where safe countries make arrangements with safe countries, and you're allowed to travel freely with no quarantine between those countries, and that's kind of an interesting idea, and Israel is pursuing that. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are doing it. They're prioritizing business travel and education travel, so student travel, which is very interesting, over tourism. Tourism is not prioritized. The Czech Republic, Austria, Slovakia, Germany are going to be a bubble, and Australia and New Zealand are going to be a bubble because they actually did very well, and they both had very similar graphs. So they're both coping around the same way. Israel is currently establishing a bubble, travel bubble relationship with Cyprus and Greece. So those are popular tourist destinations for Israelis. They're also very close, and they're also countries that are doing well. So that's being negotiated. A third option is testing. So the most common kind of testing that they're talking about is called PCR testing, which is polymerase chain reaction testing. The issue with the PCR testing is, number one, there's a pretty good rate of false negatives, so it's not 100% accurate, obviously. It is something that can be tested relatively quickly. The problem with this virus is you need a certain viral load, and I've been saying this the whole time, but you need a certain viral load to test positive. So I can get this tested the day before I travel, but I can already have higher levels that could spread the contagion by the time I travel. So the PCR test is not a great test because it's not telling us what's going to happen tomorrow. And a lot of countries are considering this for up to 3 days before you travel. And that's a very long time in the incubation of this disease. So Greece, for example, is requiring proof of a PCR test within 3 days of travel. Dubai is going to do them in the airport, and they're still going to quarantine people, but they're going to offer the testing in the airport. Austria wants to do wants to charge for mandatory testing at the airport, but you can bring proof that you've had the test within 3 days. And the Czech Republic is going to make people quarantine even if they test negative, but possibly under different conditions. So that's another way to look at this. And then there's a fourth idea, which is basically putting specific kinds of travelers that are considered lower risk travelers in fast track groups. So that would mean students, which is great for gap year programs, students, teachers, doctors, professionals that are needed, business workers, people who own businesses or property in Israel, agricultural or industrial workers from neighboring countries who might be migrating. And those people will not require quarantine, but will be tested upon either departing or landing, or possibly both. So China is requiring the testing when people land. Some countries require when people depart because they don't want sick people on the airplane. The Czech Republic is not requiring testing for people who are going to be in the country for 72 hours. So those are for economically essential people. They will be limited to travel between their home, which might be a hotel, but home and business. They will not be able to go touring. So travel restrictions for the people who are not getting tested is another possibility that we're seeing in the Czech Republic. If people are staying for longer than that, they have to be tested, and they have to be tested again every 30 days to make sure that they're still negative. So this is for workers who come to the country and stay longer term. With the proof of a negative test, foreign workers, students, and short-term stays don't require quarantine, especially if they're coming in for very short stays. So that's also an interesting idea. In the terminal itself, there are going to be some changes. So number one, there are going to be temperature checks. That may be done through, the infrared, which is not the best way to check temperature, but they're also looking into thermal cameras to actually be able to single people out who have a temperature of 38 degrees Celsius or more. The food courts will be closed, takeaway will be available, the stores will be closed, non-travelers will not be allowed in the airport, pickup will be in the parking lot, there'll be separate terminals for domestic and international flights so that the people who are on the domestic flights are not exposed to the international travelers. A reduction of crowds, all different kinds of crowd control, separated seating areas in the waiting area. And on the flights themselves, the International Air Transport Association is recommending the following things. Number one, people have to wear a mask, whether they're passengers or crew, they have to wear a mask the entire flight. There have to be temperature checks or PCR tests before boarding. Again, errors and timing are a big issue with the testing. No sale of items like the duty-free shopping is going to be closed. Alcohol will not be sold. There will not be selected seating. Everyone will sit in a random place, so there's a little bit less interaction. Reduction or elimination of hand luggage. Interesting. Boarding and disembarking in small groups. So they're going to call maybe row by row, maybe a couple of rows at a time to prevent crowding. And food will not be allowed on short flights at all. And on longer flights, it will be prepackaged. There won't be any fresh food. Um, they're also in the middle of discussing with the airlines reducing the number of people per flight, possibly leaving the middle seat open. Of course, the airlines are against that because then they don't make as much money, but they're leaning towards making it mandatory anyway. So we've seen that in the news, and that's something that's coming up. So here's some ideas about what the international community is thinking about in terms of returning tourism. It looks like mid-June is a good target date for us to think of in terms of when some travel and tourism is going to be allowed. And let's see how things pick up. I'll give you updates as they come. Take care, everybody.